Figures stood again. Linda, David. They hadn't announced themselves, hadn't come forward, just lingered where the light began to fade. Rebecca saw them, didn't wave, didn't smile. She just turned back toward the circle of people who had claimed her without condition. Because sometimes punishment isn't rage, it's replacement. It's watching strangers clap for the daughter you forgot to meet at the gate. That evening, she returned home and prepared one last care box before bed. As she sealed it, the doorbell rang. A volunteer couple, newlyweds, both former military, dropped off supplies. The woman hugged Rebecca tightly as if they'd known each other for years. And in a way they had not, through family, through truth, through survival, through the choice to stand when silence tells you to kneel. After they left, Rebecca stood in the kitchen alone, breathing in the stillness. And that's when it hit her, not as a dramatic revelation, but as something gentle. She wasn't the widow anymore. She wasn't the one whose family didn't show. She was Rebecca, the founder, the one people called when they didn't know who else would understand. The one whose name was whispered in waiting rooms, passed between women in uniform, printed in letters from across the country. No one called for her mother. No one mentioned David. No one asked what happened to them because the story had outgrown them. And corruption. This is the largest anti-narcotic success in more than 20 years. The screen flickered. B-roll footage began to play. Helicopters slicing through jungle canopies, masked agents storming compounds, crates of cash and weapons being seized. Rachel's pulse surged. Then it happened. Her name. The operation was commanded by Special Agent in Charge Rachel Moore, the anchor continued, a 24-year DEA veteran whose leadership and undercover intelligence work were instrumental to the mission's success. Her official headshot appeared on the screen in uniform. Stern, confident, nothing like the invisible figure at the back of a wedding. Rachel inhaled slowly, the rush of adrenaline mixing with disbelief. There it was, the name that had been ignored, downplayed, forgotten, now lit up across national news. And still she felt that familiar ache in her chest. The screen transitioned again, this time to exclusive footage obtained from body cams during the raid. A compound engulfed in smoke, men with rifles shouting in Spanish. Then a figure in black stepped into the frame, goggles, helmet, flak vest, Rachel. She raised her hand in a rapid gesture. Go! The tactical team moved in silence behind her. The image froze mid-action and the camera zoomed in. Sources confirm this masked agent is Moore herself, seen directing the assault on the Vega stronghold just hours before arrests were made. The anchor said Moore was embedded for nearly 6 months under deep cover. Her actions not only saved her team, but exposed high-level leaks in multiple agencies. Rachel exhaled. That footage had been classified just days ago. Now the entire country was watching it. And somewhere in that ballroom, her father was still toasting Vanessa's scholarship to Yale Med, still brushing Rachel off as working security. She turned her head slowly toward the double doors leading back into the wedding. The music had shifted, something upbeat, celebratory. Laughter echoed faintly through the heavy wood. They had no idea. For a moment, Rachel was pulled backward. 17 years old, standing alone outside her high school auditorium in full uniform. Her class had voted her to give the closing speech at the J. Chun JROTC Awards. She just won a scholarship to attend the U.S. Army's Early Admission Leadership Program. Only one girl in the state had been selected that year. Her father never showed. He told her, It's not a real graduation, Ra. You're just playing soldier. We've got Vanessa's piano recital that night. She remembered staring at the empty chair in the front row, the one she had saved just in case. Her mum didn't come either. No one did. And still she had stood straight, delivered her speech, and saluted the flag as if her family were cheering behind her. Back in the hallway, Rachel blinked away the memory. The screen now showed a map of cartel routes dismantled by her operation. Red lines crossing continents, entire networks reduced to blinking icons. The bartender behind the counter looked up, catching sight of her watching the broadcast. "Damn," he muttered, eyes on the screen. "Whoever led that ops, a badass." Rachel gave him a small nod and turned back to the ballroom. They were still dancing, still clinking glasses, still laughing. No one had checked the news. To them, she was still just the big sister who never married, who never made headlines, who worked in government and never settled down. Rachel placed one hand on the door, her face calm, her heartbeat steady. Tonight, the truth would walk into that room, and it would not ask permission. Rachel re-entered the ballroom like a shadow slipping back into the corner. The music was soft now, a gentle instrumental behind the clinking of silverware and murmured conversations. She moved quietly past the crowd, unnoticed, as if the face on the television moments ago didn't belong to her. She slid back into her seat just as her father rose from his chair, champagne flute in hand, tapping the side with his wedding band to gather attention. The room gradually quieted, heads turning toward Albert Moore as he cleared his throat. "I just want to say a few words," he began, smiling at Vanessa and her husband with fatherly warmth. "What a day! What a blessing!" Rachel's shoulders stiffened. Albert turned to the guests, voice booming with practiced confidence. "Vanessa, she's always been a light in our lives. From her piano recital to her residency interviews, she's made us proud every step of the way. And now she's married a brilliant man with a bright future. What more could a father ask for?" The crowd chuckled and raised glasses. Rachel stared at her water glass, willing herself to be invisible. She already knew what was coming. "And of course," Albert continued, "our Rachel is here too." A ripple of polite applause followed. Albert nodded vaguely in her direction. "Rachel works for the government, something in security, I think. Not the flashiest job, but it's stable. We're proud of her too. Not everyone takes the same path. Some of us take detours, right? Detours." The word hung in the air like a slap. Rachel swallowed hard, her jaw clenched, but her face remained composed. She'd been trained to hold her expression under pressure. Cartel lords, corrupt generals, even armed insurgents couldn't shake her. But this man, her own father, had an unmatched talent for unraveling her with just a few words. Flash! A memory surged forward, sharp and uninvited. 17, a folder clutched in her hand, acceptance letter to West Point. She had worked for it with everything she had. Sleepless nights, grueling physicals, endless interviews. She had even passed the congressional nomination hurdle. It was her dream, and she had done it. She had waited until Sunday dinner to share the news. Her father had listened, silent, as she explained every detail with excitement. Her mother had smiled weakly, but said nothing. Then Albert had leaned back in his chair, taken a slow sip of wine, and said, "Rah, honey, don't you think that's more of a boy's world? I mean, boots and uniforms and what? Crawling through mud? That's not the kind of life I imagined for my daughter." Rachel had frozen, letter still in hand. He'd continued, chuckling. "You've always been creative. You should do something safer, something softer, a good administrative job. You're not going to war, sweetheart." She hadn't responded. The words had sliced through her like glass. That night, she'd gone to her room and cried silently into her pillow, then folded the letter back into the envelope like it had never existed. But she hadn't let it go. She'd applied to a different path, one her father wouldn't be able to touch. Law enforcement, intelligence, DEA. He never asked what she chose instead. Back in the present, Albert was still speaking, now telling a story about Vanessa organizing a fundraiser in college. Rachel stared past him, hearing the words but not listening. Her mind was back in that kitchen, back with the girl who had been told to dream smaller, to stay safe, to stay invisible. She took another sip of water, her hands steady, her face unreadable. But inside, something had cracked wide open. Near the center of the ballroom, a young man in a grey blazer leaned back in his chair and casually pulled out his phone. Rachel caught the movement with the edge of her vision, probably checking fantasy football scores or texting a friend about the open bar. But then she noticed his brows furrow, the casual smirk fading from his face. He stared at the screen, then looked up right at her. Their eyes met just for a second, and Rachel saw the dawning realization flicker in his expression. The man turned to his date and whispered something, nudging the phone toward her. She gasped softly, then looked from the phone to Rachel, her eyes widening. Another guest nearby glanced over, curious. Then another. The whisper spread like wildfire, table to table, subtle at first. Heads began to tilt. Phones lit up under white linen-covered tables. Murmurs grew like wind before a storm. Rachel stayed still. The photo being passed around was unmistakable. Her face under the banner DEA hero leads historic cartel takedown, her name in bold special agent in charge Rachel Moore. The woman in the ballroom with the plain dress and silent seat had just been unveiled as the lead figure in a global story, and the guests were beginning to put the pieces together. Across the room, people who had offered her pitying smiles were now turning red with recognition. Others stared as if seeing her for the first time, because in truth, they were. Rachel didn't move. She didn't smile, she didn't raise a glass or nod in acknowledgement. Her expression remained calm, but inside her chest, something ancient and raw was unraveling. It wasn't the fame that stirred her, it wasn't the shock on their faces. It was the deep ache that even in the moment of her greatest public triumph, the man at the center of this celebration, her father, was still blind to who she really was. Albert Moore continued his speech like nothing had changed, unaware that the room had shifted. And as I was saying, he chuckled, glass still raised. Rachel's always been steady, a background kind of person, doesn't like the spotlight. You know, some people are meant to support others, and that's fine. Rachel had a sharp intake of breath from someone 2 tables over. Another guest shook their head slightly, lips pursed. The dissonance between his words and the news alerts buzzing in their hands had become impossible to ignore. Still, he went on. She never cared for fancy things, never chased promotions, just kept her head down. You know, I respect that not everyone's meant to shine. Rachel's hands were folded in her lap. Her spine was straight, her eyes locked on her father, even as his stayed fixed on the imaginary version of her he'd always preferred. Inside, she felt a storm building, the pride she couldn't voice, the pain she couldn't erase. The yearning for a moment she'd finally accepted would never come. People were staring openly now. A woman 2 seats away whispered to her husband, "That's her right from the news." He nodded slowly, still watching Rachel as if waiting for her to stand and confirm it. She didn't. The attention should have felt validating, but it didn't. It felt hollow because it wasn't coming from where it mattered most. Albert finally set down his glass, smiling proudly as he returned to his seat beside Vanessa. He hadn't noticed the change, the silence, the way guests were whispering and searching his daughter's name on national news. Rachel exhaled softly. They were all starting to see, but he was still blind, and that hurt more than anything. The clink of a dropped fork was the only sound in the pause after her father's speech ended. Guests were frozen mid-sip, mid-whisper, unsure of what to say next. All eyes slowly shifted toward Rachel. Then she stood, a sudden movement in a sea of stillness. Chairs creaked, heads turned, and a hush fell across the ballroom. Her father looked up, confused by the interruption, his brow furrowing in annoyance. "Rachel," he said, voice still loud enough to carry, "is something wrong?" Rachel took a single step forward, then another, heels echoing across the marble floor. She didn't speak yet. She walked slowly, deliberately toward the center of the room. The spotlight meant for the cake-cutting ceremony caught her mid-stride, casting her in soft gold. When she finally stopped, she stood with her hands calmly at her sides, back straight, face composed. "My name," she began, her voice clear and strong, "is Special Agent in Charge Rachel Moore." A gasp rippled through the room. She let the words settle before continuing. "I've served in federal law enforcement for 24 years. I currently lead South American operations for the DEA, and as of this week, I directed the successful takedown of the Vega cartel, an operation that took over 2 years, involved 5 governments, and dismantled one of the most violent narcotics empires in modern history." Dead silence. Albert stared at her, mouth slightly open, champagne flute frozen mid-air. Rachel continued, voice unwavering. For those of you still wondering, yes, I'm the woman from the news, the one who led Operation Crimson Winter, the one whose team seized over $2.3 billion in cartel assets in the past 72 hours. Twist 4 came next. She took a step forward and rolled her right shoulder slightly, indicating the strap of her dress. "You see this scar?" she asked quietly, lifting her hand to gently trace the faint, jagged line just visible along her shoulder blade. A few guests leaned in, their expressions shifting from shock to disbelief. "I got that in Bolivia," she said, during a failed assassination attempt by a cartel lieutenant. "I spent 11 days in a hospital under an alias with no contact to my team or my agency, because any leaked intel would have gotten more people killed." The room had transformed into a vacuum. People weren't breathing. Albert looked like he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. "I came back from that." Rachel said, "I went deeper undercover. I rebuilt our intelligence network from scratch. I trained agents, led raids, negotiated with foreign militaries, and I did all of that without a single member of my family ever asking what I really did." Her eyes swept the room. "Because you all thought you knew who I was." Whispers had stopped. There was only the steady thump of the music leaking in from the hallway, and the distant buzz of cell phones still lighting up with the breaking news. Rachel inhaled. "And maybe that's partly my fault," she added softer now. "I didn't tell you, I didn't push. I thought maybe one day you'd see me for who I was without needing a headline." She looked directly at her father, but I was wrong. The silence in the ballroom had shifted. It wasn't just shock anymore, it was weight. The kind of stillness that comes when the air itself thickens with realization. Rachel stood at the center of it, steady as a monument, while the people who once pied her now blinked in stunned disbelief. A woman near the edge of the dance floor raised a napkin to her face, dabbing tears she hadn't expected to shed. A young man at the bar lowered his phone, whispering, "Oh my God," to no one in particular. The bride, Vanessa, looked frozen in place, mouth slightly parted, the bouquet in her hands hanging, forgotten. And Rachel wasn't finished. She looked out over the crowd, her tone shifting from declaration to something more intimate. Her voice softened, but carried no less power. "There's something else," she said, "something I never thought I'd say in public, but I think it's time." The room held its breath. "Years ago," she continued, "someone in this room, a family member, nearly got pulled into something dark. Drugs. Not street dealing, but connected to the same cartel I just helped dismantle. It started with a party, then a favor, then a little delivery for a little cash. More murmurs now, confused glances darting around the room. Rachel didn't name names. She didn't have to. They were young, scared, and they didn't know who to turn to, but they came to me, and I made sure their name never showed up on any report. I buried the connection, cleaned the trail, and paid off a loose end to keep them safe. I took care of it because that's what family is supposed to do." A gasp rippled through a cluster of guests at the center table. An older cousin leaned toward his wife and whispered fiercely. Vanessa's husband stared at Rachel like he was watching someone he didn't know but wanted to. Rachel let the words settle, then added, "No one in this family ever knew. I never told anyone, not even the person I protected because I didn't want a thank you. I just wanted to believe that maybe in some way I still belonged here." Her voice trembled slightly at the end, but she didn't flinch. From the head table, Albert Moore slowly rose to his feet. His face was pale now. He wasn't smiling anymore. His hands fidgeted with his empty glass, unsure of where to rest. "Rachel, he stammered. I didn't know." She turned to him fully, eyes calm but sharp. "Of course you didn't," she said. "You never asked." He took a step forward, reaching out slightly. "I didn't mean to. To make you feel—" Rachel lifted a hand, not to silence the room, but to draw a boundary. "Don't," she said, voice still even. "Don't call me that." Albert blinked. "What? What do you mean?" "If you're not going to say it right," she replied, "then don't say it at all." He hesitated, his mouth opening, then closing again. "Rachel," she said firmly. "Special Agent Rachel Moore. That's the name I fought for, that's the name I bled for, and that's the name I want to hear." The entire ballroom was silent again. This time not in shock, but in reverence, like they were witnessing something sacred, something long overdue. Rachel's eyes didn't leave her father's. "You don't have to understand it, you just have to respect it." Albert's hand dropped to his side. He gave a single nod, small, unsure but real. And for the first time in her life, Rachel saw not the man who had always diminished her, but someone who might, just might, be starting to listen. Rachel let the room settle into silence before she spoke again, not to lash out or defend, but to explain, to expose what her uniform had hidden for years. "People think federal work is all action movies and briefings," she said, pacing slowly. "But the truth, it's disappearing, becoming someone else for months, sometimes years, losing your name, your voice, your habits." She stopped near the floral arch meant for wedding photos and looked up at the ceiling lights, before returning her gaze to the crowd. I spent 2 years undercover in Colombia. My name wasn't Rachel Moore. It was Lucia Alvarez, a money laundering consultant with fake documents, fake family, fake history. I lived in a house with people who would have killed me if I blinked wrong. I had to learn their jokes, drink their liquor, and pretend I didn't flinch when they tested loyalty with bullets. No one breathed. Rachel's voice was even, but the weight behind it pressed into every ear. I sent messages to my handlers by hiding codes in ledgers. I smuggled files through bakery orders. And I did all of this while pretending not to cry on nights I remembered birthdays or Vanessa's college graduation that I missed because I was trying not to die. She walked back toward the center, slower now, letting her words soak in. Then came Bolivia. The mood in the room shifted again, subtle but sharp. Twist 6 was coming. I had cultivated a high-level contact, one of the cartels in a circle, a man named Rivas. He promised access to the upper ranks. He promised me an in. She paused, but Rivas was a double agent paid off by someone inside. Gasps followed as realization hit. Yes, Rachel confirmed. We had a mole inside our own agency, a man who knew my location, my cover, and my schedule, and he sold me out. Now the silence was brittle. They came for me one night, 3 of them, guns, knives, the works. I barely got out. Took 2 bullets, one grazed my arm, one clipped my shoulder. I ran barefoot through the jungle for over a mile to reach extraction. Rachel rotated her right shoulder slightly as if remembering the pain, but the price wasn't just physical. My identity was burned, the operation was blown, and my life was officially declared compromised. She looked around. I had to disappear for real this time. Mouths parted in disbelief. Somewhere near the back, someone whispered, "She went dark." For 6 months, Rachel said, I was dead. No contact, no agency access. I lived in a safe house in the Andes under heavy guard while we cleaned up the betrayal. I had 1 book, 1 window, no name, just a pulse. She paused again, then smiled bitterly. And during that entire time, not one person from this family called, not one message, not one email. A wave of guilt rippled through the room like static because no one noticed I was gone. She met Vanessa's eyes across the room. You were busy planning your engagement party. The bride flinched, tears springing into her eyes. Rachel's voice softened, not out of pity, but exhaustion. I don't blame you, not entirely. I trained you all too well. I was always the background daughter, the afterthought. So when I vanished, it just felt normal, didn't it? Someone at a table wiped their eyes. A man near the DJ booth shook his head slowly, murmuring something about not knowing. Rachel took one last breath. I came back from that. I rebuilt myself from nothing. No headlines, no parades, just scars and silence and a job I still believed in. She looked toward her father again, but this time not seeking recognition. She had passed that point. She was reclaiming space, not asking for it. Rachel looked across the ballroom, her gaze now heavier, more reflective. People often ask why I never married, why I don't have kids, why I show up to weddings alone or send gifts instead of attending holidays. She folded her hands in front of her, fingers laced tightly. It's not because I didn't want those things. A murmur of surprise rippled through the guests. Even Vanessa blinked, stunned. Rachel had always seemed distant, detached, not the type to care about those traditional milestones. I wanted a family, she said. I wanted Sunday mornings and birthdays and warm kitchens and late-night phone calls. But I chose a job that didn't allow for any of that. She paused, or rather, I chose a life that asked me to protect strangers as if they were family and to sacrifice mine in the process. Someone sniffled from the back of the room. Rachel took a breath, her eyes growing distant, and yet I did become a mother once. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward. Twist 7 was coming. It was 5 years ago during a long-term operation in Peru. I had a local informant, a young woman named Isela, 22, brave, smarter than most agents I'd worked with. She had a baby girl, barely a year old. Rachel's voice trembled, but she didn't stop. Isela helped us crack open an arm of the Morales cartel. She gave us names, routes, drop zones. She saved lives, and they found out. Gasps rippled through the room. She was murdered in front of her daughter. Now the ballroom was silent again. This silence was grief, not shock. I couldn't let that child be swallowed by the system. Rachel said her father was unknown. Her relatives were either dead or missing, and if the cartel found her, they'd finish what they started. She looked directly at her mother, whose face had gone pale. So I adopted her quietly through diplomatic channels. I filed the paperwork myself in Spanish. I changed her name, created a new birth certificate, and brought her back to the US under federal protective custody. Twist confirmed. No one in the room knew. She's 8 now, Rachel said. Smart, fierce, loves building robots and making up songs about her cat. She thinks I work for airport security. Someone near the head table laughed through tears. I've never told anyone here because it wasn't safe, Rachel continued, because her existence is still protected under agency seals. And because I didn't trust this family to keep that secret. Vanessa looked devastated. Their mother's hand trembled as she covered her mouth. Rachel's voice grew firmer. I may not have brought her into this world, but I raised her. I read to her when she had nightmares, taught her how to swim, bandaged her knees, and stood outside her classroom when she was scared to walk in alone. She turned her gaze back to her father. So, if you're wondering why I never gave you a granddaughter to hold at Thanksgiving, she took one step closer to the head. You're wrong. You already have one. A hush fell again. But you never asked. You never made space for my story, and I stopped offering it. Her eyes shimmered, but her voice held. She doesn't carry your name. And maybe she never will. But if you're looking for the child I chose to love, to protect, and to raise into a better world than the one her mother died in, she exhaled. Then congratulations, you have a granddaughter. The air in the room turned electric. A woman in the second row burst into tears. Vanessa covered her mouth, her face crumpling. Even Albert, for the first time, seemed unsure whether to sit or stand. Rachel finished quietly. If you all wanted someone to carry the family forward, you should know she already has a mother. She didn't say it out of spite. She said it because it was the truth. And this time, no one dared to look away. The room cracked open, not with sound, but with silence so thick it hummed in people's ears. Words had weight tonight, and Rachel had thrown a mountain's worth into the ballroom. No one looked at their plates anymore, no one touched their drinks. Vanessa stood slowly. Her wedding veil, once pristine and poised, now drooped slightly off-center. Her mascara had begun to smudge. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. You had a child, she said, voice trembling, all these years, and you never told me. Rachel's gaze softened but didn't falter. It wasn't about trust, it was about safety. Vanessa's lip quivered. I told you everything about my life, every failed relationship, every exam I cried over, every time I thought I couldn't handle med school. And you were raising a child in secret. Rachel hesitated. This wasn't the accusation of a jealous sister, it was grief. Wounded disbelief. You disappeared, Rachel, Vanessa said louder now. You weren't just missing at holidays. You weren't there when I broke my ankle in college. You weren't there when Daniel died. You weren't there when I graduated. You missed everything. Rachel took a slow breath. I was in Myanmar when Daniel's car crashed. She said, living under an alias, sleeping on concrete, translating satellite feeds to track a child trafficking ring. If I'd broken cover, I'd have put 5 agents and dozens of victims at risk. She paused. When you graduated med school, I was in Guatemala coordinating with local forces to intercept a shipment of fentanyl disguised as blood bags. Her voice grew firmer. I didn't miss your life because I didn't care. I missed it because I was trying to save the lives of girls just like you. The crowd stirred, some nodding through their tears, others simply stunned. Vanessa stared at her. You could have told me, Rachel shook her head, and made you complicit, put you at risk. I couldn't. I chose this life, Vanessa. You didn't. Neither did Mum or Dad. Their mother sat motionless, still reeling. Albert looked like a man clinging to a script that had just caught fire in his hands. He stood abruptly, voice cracking as he attempted to regain control. All right, that's enough. This is a wedding, not an interrogation. Can we please get back to no, someone said firmly from the back. All heads turned. It was a cousin Mark from Rachel's mother's side. He stood with his arms crossed, his wife beside him, nodding. She's earned her moment, Mark said. Let her finish. Albert blinked. He looked around, perhaps expecting someone to back him. But the crowd stayed quiet, and the silence was louder than any vote could be. Rachel's voice dropped lower. I'm not here to ruin Vanessa's day. I came because Director Wells made me take the weekend off. He said I'd worked too hard, risked too much, and needed to be reminded why I do what I do. She looked directly at Vanessa now, sir, and I remembered why. I remembered sitting at a cartel border camp in Panama, holding a girl barely older than you when they found her. She'd been trafficked for 3 years. She had her sister's name carved into her wrist. That's why I fight. Vanessa covered her mouth, tears falling freely now. I didn't show up to your graduation, Vanessa, Rachel said. But I've spent every day since protecting girls who never even got the chance to finish school. Her voice cracked only slightly. I wasn't there because I was out there. Albert slumped back in his chair. His attempt at control fully dissolved. His face was no longer red with embarrassment, but pale with something harder to name. Regret, maybe, or shame. The guests didn't move. No one whispered anymore. Every eye was on Rachel, and finally, they weren't looking through her. They were seeing her. For the first time, the story of her absence had become the story of her sacrifice, and no one in that room would ever forget it. Just as the silence threatened to settle into something permanent, Rachel's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at the screen. A familiar name lit up, Director Wells, the guest noticed. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then swiped to answer. Director, she said calmly, turning slightly away from the crowd. The voice on the other end was firm and clear, loud enough for those nearest to catch every word. "Rachel, I hope I'm not interrupting, but I need your answer." She blinked. "Regarding the White House," he replied, "they want to meet first thing Monday. The president wants you at the table for the Southern Corridor briefing. Homeland's pushing for your input. Are you available?" A sharp inhale echoed from someone near the cake table. Glasses trembled in a few hands. Twist 8 had landed. "I can make it," Rachel said, her voice steady. "Good," Director Wells replied. "And just so you know, I told them the same thing I've been telling every agency lead this week." Rachel raised an eyebrow, which is, the director didn't hesitate. "That you're the best we've got, that this agency wouldn't be where it is today without you, and that when I step down next year, you're the future of the DEA." Gasps, audible, sharp, immediate. Someone muttered as, "She's been groomed for director." Yeah, Rachel stood still, letting the words hang. Wells added, "I'll follow up with details later. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, Agent Moore. You've earned it." The call ended. The ballroom held its breath. It was no longer just her family that had to face who she really was, it was everyone. Albert stared at her now, mouth slightly open, face pale. He looked as though he'd never seen her before, and in many ways he hadn't. All his rehearsed stories, his careful hierarchy of pride, had been shattered by one phone call. His daughter was not a security guard. She was a national figure, the DEA's future, the woman the President of the United States wanted in the Situation Room. Vanessa sat quietly beside him, her tear-streaked face unreadable. Their mother's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white, as if holding onto something slipping through her fingers. Rachel didn't look away. She scanned the room, took in the stunned expressions, the lowered gazes of those who once pied her. Then she turned back to her father. "Do you understand now?" she asked, not harshly, but with finality. Albert opened his mouth, then closed it again. Whatever he wanted to say, it wouldn't have mattered. Rachel nodded slowly. "You don't need to," she said. "You don't need to understand what I've done, what I've built, or what it cost me." She looked around again because now everyone else does. That landed heavier than any blow. She had stopped needing his recognition the moment she stood in front of them all and claimed her own narrative. But now they couldn't pretend not to know. Her truth was public. It was undeniable, and it belonged to her. She straightened her shoulders. "I won't apologize for the life I chose. I won't shrink myself to fit the version of me you preferred." Rachel turned her attention back to the crowd one last time. "This wasn't how I planned to spend the weekend," she said, voice laced with the barest edge of dry humor. A few people chuckled nervously. "But if nothing else, I'm glad you all got to meet me and the real me." She glanced at her phone, then back to her father. "I have a meeting with the president on Monday, but tonight I just wanted to remind my family who I am." And with that, Rachel stepped away from the spotlight. She didn't need applause. She had finally been seen. Rachel glanced toward the stage where the microphone still sat in its cradle, untouched by anyone but her. She didn't need it anymore. Every word that had to be said had already been spoken, some too late, some never expected to be voiced at all. Now all that remained was the exit. She took one final look around the room. The chandeliers still glowed softly, casting golden light on faces that now reflected something new. Not pity, not dismissal, not confusion, respect, even awe. She stepped toward the head table. Vanessa rose instinctively, her wedding dress flowing as she moved to meet her sister. The tension between them had changed. It wasn't gone, but it had softened, reshaped by revelation. Rachel stopped in front of her, her voice gentle. "You look beautiful tonight." Vanessa nodded, still holding back tears. "You're incredible." "I just do my job," Rachel said quietly. "No," Vanessa whispered, "you do more than that. You protect the world, and you did it alone. I'm sorry we never saw it." Rachel shook her head. "I didn't need you to see it back then, but I'm glad you do now." They hugged, brief but real. Rachel then turned to the table and met her mother's eyes. The older woman looked fragile now, like something inside her had cracked, but not yet healed. She didn't speak, she just nodded. A silent acknowledgement passed between mother and daughter. It was enough for now. Then Rachel looked at her father. Albert didn't rise. His hands rested in his lap, his eyes sunken in thought. He didn't try to reach out again, and Rachel didn't expect him to. Some gaps took a lifetime to cross, and others simply never would. She gave him a single nod, dignified, distant, but not cruel, then turned back toward the exit. She passed by tables of people who had once whispered about her as the unmarried sister, the government employee, the quiet one. Now they watched in stillness, some standing as she passed. One woman clapped softly, almost unconsciously, and others followed, not loud, not performative, but respectful. Rachel didn't acknowledge the applause. She wasn't here for a standing ovation. As she reached the ballroom doors, a server opened them for her with a quiet mom. She gave a polite nod and stepped through, the heavy wood swinging shut behind her with a quiet finality. The hallway outside felt cooler, calmer. Her heels clicked against the marble as she walked toward the hotel lobby. Every step away from the reception felt lighter, freer. She had carried the weight of invisibility for so long, she hadn't realized how heavy it had become. Rachel paused at a side table near the coat check, reaching for her blazer. As she slipped it on, a bellhop passed and nodded at her, eyes wide. He didn't say anything, but she knew he'd seen the news. Everyone had. She pulled out her phone and checked the time. Still a few hours before midnight. She'd done what she came for. She hadn't planned it. She hadn't rehearsed it. But somehow every word had landed exactly where it needed to. And for once, it wasn't just the president or the director or her team who understood what she was worth. It was home, or what used to be home. Rachel walked through the automatic doors and stepped into the night. The air was crisp and the sky above her was clear. She looked up for a moment, then toward the quiet parking lot. No more waiting to be called on, no more shrinking to fit someone else's story. Her goodbye hadn't needed a speech, only truth, and that finally had been enough. Rachel had nearly reached the edge of the parking lot, her breath misting slightly in the evening air when she heard it. Not loudly, barely above the breeze rustling the ornamental trees outside the hotel, but enough to stop her mid-step. Rachel, her father's voice, no sarcasm, no impatience, just a single word, heavy with weight he'd never carried before. She turned slowly. Albert Moore stood just outside the doors, hands trembling slightly as he held them at his sides. His tie was loosened, tuxedo slightly wrinkled like the illusion he had worn for decades had started to collapse. He stepped forward one pace. "I'm sorry," he said, voice raw and thin. "Rachel, I'm sorry." The use of her real name struck her harder than she expected. Rachel, not Becca, not my daughter who works security, not the other one, just her name said like it mattered. It was the first time in her adult life he had used it with sincerity. Twist 9 unfolded, not like a thunderclap, but a quiet, aching fracture, the kind that shifted something inside her without needing to shout. She blinked, eyes stinging unexpectedly. After everything, after all the years of silence, of dismissal, of being written out of the narrative, this man had finally said 2 words that felt real. And yet she didn't move toward him, didn't rush into his arms, didn't let herself collapse into a daughter-shaped space that had never truly been hers. Instead, she looked him in the eye. The same eyes that used to look past her at dinner tables, through her at family gatherings. Her voice was low but firm. "You don't need to apologize." Albert flinched slightly, as if bracing for rejection. Rachel stepped closer, just enough for her words to reach him clearly. "But you do need to remember." He looked confused. "Remember what? That this time," she said, her voice cracking only slightly, "I stood up." Albert nodded, slow and unsure. "I never wanted to embarrass you," he said softly. "I just didn't understand." Rachel nodded back, but her expression remained unreadable. "I didn't need you to understand," she replied. "I just needed you to stop pretending I didn't exist." He took another tentative step. "I was wrong about a lot." She let out a breath. "Yeah, you were." A beat passed. The sound of the hotel doors swishing shut behind him felt like punctuation. "You were always so quiet," he added. "I thought you didn't want the attention." Rachel gave a short laugh. "Tired, not cruel. You can't crave what you've never been offered." Albert dropped his gaze. "I always thought Daniel would be the one to," he began. Rachel held up a hand. "I'm not Daniel, I know. Then stop comparing." His eyes welled with something unfamiliar. Grief, maybe, not for the son he'd lost, but for the daughter he'd never tried to see. "You did good tonight," he said. "You were incredible." Rachel looked away for a moment, gathering herself, then back at him. "Thanks." They stood there in silence, father and daughter under a hotel awning, their shadows cast long by the parking lot lights. Finally, Rachel offered one last truth. "I didn't need you to be proud of me tonight," she said. "I needed you to be proud of me when no one else was watching." Albert looked as if the words had hit a place no one else had ever reached. "I'll try," he whispered. Rachel gave a small, solemn nod. "That's all I ever want." He opened his mouth to say something else, but Rachel had already turned. This time, she didn't walk away heavy. She walked away whole. As she reached her car, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. Albert was still standing there looking after her, not as a disappointment, not as a stranger, but maybe for the first time as his daughter. Not perfect, not performative, just real. Rachel opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. Her phone buzzed on the console. Another message from Director Wells. "Monday confirmed. Situation room. They'll be waiting for you." She smiled softly. Then, before starting the engine, she whispered to herself, "Let them wait." Tonight, for once, she had come home. The drive back to her apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. Rachel kept the radio off, letting the soft hum of the tires on asphalt soothe her nerves. She didn't replay the evening in her head. At least not all of it. She didn't need to. The things that mattered had already settled into place. By the time she pulled into the underground garage beneath her modest apartment building, the tension in her shoulders had begun to ease. The elevator ride up to the 5th floor was uneventful. She was just another tired woman in a black dress, heels in one hand, badge in the other. Inside her apartment, the air greeted her like an old friend, warm, quiet, filled with the familiar scent of lavender and ink. She set her keys on the table, shrugged out of her jacket, and took a deep breath. Home. Not the kind that had family portraits or generations of heirlooms, but hers. She kicked off her shoes and walked barefoot across the hardwood floor. On the wall above her desk hung a single framed photo. Her and a little girl both wearing matching aviator sunglasses, grinning like fools. It wasn't a posed portrait, it was a moment. One snapped on a summer day in the park, ice cream melting down their hands. She smiled and touched the edge of the frame lightly. Then her phone buzzed again. She picked it up from the counter and unlocked it. A new email. Subject: White House confirmation. Rachel scanned the message. Agent Moore, the President looks forward to meeting you. The Southern Corridor briefing has been confirmed for 10:00 a.m. Monday. Please coordinate with Homeland Security for briefing access. You will be seated with agency leads. It was real now, not just headlines or calls. Her seat at the table had been secured, but that wasn't what made her sit down. It was the second email, one that came from a name she didn't immediately recognize. Subject: You changed my life. She opened it. Dear Agent Moore, I know you probably don't remember me. I'm just one of the many who passed through Quantico under your training module 2 years ago. I was the quiet one, third row, always afraid to raise my hand, but I wanted to say thank you, not just for your lessons or your discipline or your leadership, but because you were the first person who ever made me believe someone like me could do this job. You didn't just teach us how to chase suspects or build cases. You taught us how to carry ourselves with integrity, with purpose, and with fire. I joined the DEA because of you. And this week, watching you on the news, I knew I made the right choice. We're all proud of you, and we've got your back, Agent T. Velasquez. Rachel's hand trembled slightly as she set the phone down. It wasn't the praise that got to her. It was the knowing, the realization that somewhere out there someone had seen her clearly, all along. Not for the headlines, not for the rank, but for what she gave quietly, persistently, unseelie elebrated. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. Not the sharp, bitter kind she'd cried in hotel rooms or safe houses, but the soft, cleansing kind that came when a wound had finally found air and light. She let herself sit there for a moment longer in the quiet glow of her living room lamp, surrounded by silence that no longer felt lonely. Then she rose, walked into the bedroom and opened a small locked drawer. Inside was a worn notebook. She flipped to the back pages. Dozens of names scribbled in tiny handwriting. People she'd saved. Informants she'd buried under aliases. Children she'd pulled out of hellholes. And now she added one more line. T. Velasquez, Hope. Rachel closed the book, returned it to its drawer, and stood. There was still more to do, always would be. But for the first time in her life, the war outside didn't make her feel like a ghost inside. She had walked through the fire, through exile, through invisibility. And now she was seen, not by the news, not by the president, but by the ones who mattered, and by herself. Rachel stood in the kitchen, a steaming mug of tea warming her hands when her phone buzzed again. She sighed, thinking it might be another agency update or media inquiry, but the name on the screen made her freeze mid-sip. Liar. She tapped open the message. Mum, I saw everything. I watched the speech online. My friends at campus couldn't stop talking about it, and I just wanted to say, you didn't have to be perfect to make me proud. You already did. Love you always. Rachel stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly as her eyes filled. Twist Hen wasn't explosive. It wasn't shocking. It was soft, simple. Exactly what it needed to be. She hadn't spoken to Leia since the start of the week. Final season at university had kept her busy, and Rachel never wanted to pull her daughter into the chaos of her job. But now the wall between their lives had thinned. Leia had seen her, not as a shadow or a soldier or a protector from afar, as a mother. Rachel scrolled back to an older message from a few months ago, a selfie Leia had sent from campus, books piled high, messy bun on top of her head, grinning despite exhaustion. She had captioned it, "Future attorney of badass mums everywhere." Rachel smiled, placing the mug down gently and walking to her bookshelf. Tucked between an old law dictionary and a faded photo album was a frame she hadn't moved in years. Inside it, a picture of Leia at age 7 standing on a stool in Rachel's kitchen, stirring a pot of tomato soup with oversized goggles on. She'd insisted she was testing food safety, and Rachel, exhausted after 3 back-to-back stakeouts, had let her. That moment had lived in Rachel's heart longer than most operations, longer than most awards. She sat down with the frame in her lap, her fingers brushing the glass. All the years she'd spent protecting Leia had never been for recognition. Not from her agency, not from her family, not from the world, just from her. Just so that this girl, born into fear, into danger, could one day walk freely across a law school campus, surrounded by books and possibilities, and know that she mattered, that she had someone who would always, always stand in front of the fire for her. Rachel opened a new message window and typed slowly, "Thanks, kid. I'm proud of you too. You've always been the best thing I've ever done." She hovered over the send button for a moment, then tapped it. There, done. Not classified, not encrypted, just honest. She stood again, returning the frame to its shelf, this time placing it in front of her badge. Then she walked to the balcony, opened the sliding door, and let the night air rush in. The city lights sparkled below, and somewhere in the distance a siren wailed. A reminder that the world kept spinning, that there was still so much to do, but tonight, for the first time in years, Rachel felt still. She wasn't chasing justice. She wasn't hiding in plain sight. She wasn't waiting for anyone to see her. She had been seen by strangers, by her team, by the girl who mattered most, and finally, by herself. She leaned on the railing, letting the breeze catch the hem of her oversized sweater. Her hair danced around her face, and she didn't bother fixing it. There was no one to impress here, only truth to carry, only peace to hold. And as she looked up at the stars, a thought rose slowly, silently in her chest. It wasn't angry or bitter. It wasn't triumphant or loud. It was simple. It was whole. Family, she thought, isn't where you're born. It's where you're finally valued. The words echoed quietly inside her, settling deep like roots, finding home in solid ground. She closed her eyes and whispered one last line, not for anyone else to hear, but for herself. Family is not where we are born. It is the last place that appreciates us. Then she turned and walked back inside, the door closing softly behind her. And for once, she didn't feel alone.